Is the West really waking up about the threat from Vladimir Putin and willing to do more to help Ukraine and force a ceasefire? And is Donald Trump serious about the plan to put more pressure on Putin to get a ceasefire in Ukraine? Plus, what is going on in Japan, where voters on Sunday took away the ruling party's majority in the upper house of the Diet, which is the equivalent of the U.S. Senate? And what are the stakes for the United States in Japan's new era of a new potential majority?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Those are our subjects for today on Potomac Watch. I'm here with my colleagues, Joe Sternberg and Kate Batchelder. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the editorial page. So let's start with Russia. Seems to be a big policy shift in the last week. President Trump agreeing to send new arms to Ukraine via European purchases, and also threatening Russia with new so-called secondary sanctions on its oil and gas sales to other countries that don't help Ukraine. If there is no progress in the next 50 days from last week on a ceasefire. And in Europe, the UK, France, and Germany got together and talked about new cooperation on defense. First, Kate, let's talk about the developments since Trump's announcement last week in the Oval Office. Some criticism emerging that this is merely more delay to give Putin more time.
Well, I think 50 days really is too long of a dispensation. We're now 6 months into this process. You have Russian officials continuing to reiterate their recalcitrance to negotiate, unwilling to cede any territory that they control, and continue to talk about a deal that would give them more territory than they control with their current military. And so Putin really has not moved off his initial negotiating position. And so I think Trump has started to wake up to that. And I think the pause in Ukraine and weapons deliveries to Ukraine actually caught the president off guard and was not part of that emerging policy shift to getting tougher on Putin. So I think now he's got to do a mix of sanctions and faster arms deliveries to Ukraine.
He is, but he's also doesn't seem, Kate, to be sending directly U.S. arms. He wants to kind of get the U.S. taxpayer out of the chain of supply chain here, have Europe buy the arms and then deliver them to Ukraine. I guess that's for domestic purposes with his base to try to mollify the isolationist wing of the GOP. Is there any other way to explain it?
Well, it is a rigmarole. And I guess if I'm trying to be charitable and optimistic about it, it does sort of get more allied effort into expanding our air defense interceptor stocks and get more investment into those lines that we need to expand anyway. But on the other hand, Paul, to your point, it is a little bit of a fudge, and it doesn't get at the core things that Ukraine needs to get a better deal to end the war. And so the U.S. continues to be kind of the premier weapons arsenals, especially for things like long-range missiles. And I think Putin is very sensitive to what happens on the battlefield, and that influences his negotiating position. And so I think Trump will have to provide some degree of more long-range help to Ukraine to help them cut off Russian lines and get a little more territory back and get Putin on the back foot. I think that's unavoidable.
When you say long range, you mean long term over time, or do you mean long range in terms of the weaponry and how deep they can reach in Russia?
I mean, both. I mean, it probably will take some time now with how dug in Putin is to get Ukraine in a better negotiating position. So it's unlikely to be something that resolves in 90 days. But I also mean distance. I mean, the U.S. has the deepest stocks of long-range missiles, like the Army Tactical Missile System, that can reach inside Russia and start to change the picture and for the better a little bit on the battlefield. And so I'm all for these faster deliveries of Patriots and helping them defend their cities from these increasingly complex drone and cruise missile and ballistic missile attacks. But I think, to your point, the president is going to have to lean in if he wants to send a more definitive message that gets Putin to come to the table.
It isn't clear to me that we are going to send those long-range Army missile systems, is it?
It's not clear to me, no. But I think, like I said, I don't think the president was read into the choice to pause weapons deliveries to Ukraine. I think he is changing his stance towards Putin a little bit, and so I still think it's a very, very live possibility that we start giving them better armaments.
All right, let's turn to sanctions and start with the European sanctions package, which did emerge last week after the meeting with the big three Britain leaders, Britain, French, and German leaders. And let's listen to Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, talk to the EU last week.
Sanctions against Russia remain one of the most effective tools for limiting its aggression. What's needed now is a truly strong 18th package of EU sanctions against Russia. The key targets should be Russia's oil trade, its shadow tanker fleet, Russian banks and other financial instruments, and the supply chains that bring equipment or parts for making weapons.
Joe Sternberg, how serious is this European sanctions package? And of course, we're almost, let's see, 2.5 years, 3 years into this war, 3.5 now, I guess. It started in February of 2022. And Europe is still not imposing maximum sanctions on Russia. It's hard to believe.
Yes, I mean, I think that this is a pretty serious package. One of the important things about it is that they are trying to close some of the holes that have been in previous sanctions packages by tightening some of the rules on imports of refined petroleum products that might have originated with oil that came out of the ground in Russia before it was being shipped somewhere else. And they are still trying to solve this problem of what's known as this shadow fleet of ships that are actually transporting this oil around the region, often in contravention of EU sanctions. So I think that the will is definitely there, and the timing point that you raised, Paul, is interesting because I think it's an example of how time has not been on Putin's side in this war, because I think that what has happened over the past 3.5 years is that, first off, European leaders, especially in these big three countries, have come to fully understand how threatened Europe is by Russia and by Vladimir Putin's territorial ambitions in the region, both in Ukraine and potentially beyond. But I think that they also have had time to get comfortable with some of the economic implications of sanctions. I mean, we're all old enough to remember February of 2022 when there was an enormous freakout across Europe about how economically destructive it would be if the continent were to impose energy sanctions on Russia. And at the time that might have been true, but over the past 3.5 years, I think that they have prepared their economies to impose tighter sanctions. The U.S. is helping by exporting more energy to Europe. But I think that they are both, now more cognizant than they were 3.5 years ago of the risks, and also better able to absorb some of the costs on Europe of opposing these sanctions on Russia.
I mean, a big question when it comes to just how effective sanctions are, Joe, is how much trouble the Russian economy is in. When oil prices are low and lower, as they have been here for some time, that puts less money into the Pentagon war machine. One of the sanctions moving ahead is to try to reduce the price on this oil price cap that the U.S. and Europe have imposed on Russian oil, so that even if it sells it to India or China, there is a cap on what it can get. And it's a complicated process involving insurance on ships, but they're trying to tighten that as well. But how much trouble is the Russian economy? And there's signs that it's reaching inflation. There's pretty high inflation. There's a sign that that some of the banks in Russia are in trouble and may need to seek a central bank bailout, but the central bank is not exactly flush.
Yes, I mean, this has been the question all along. What is the true state of the Russian economy? And I think that there are a couple big vulnerabilities there that Putin and the Kremlin have never really been able to resolve, one of which is this enormous reliance on the energy industry. I mean, it's not really clear to me that there is much of a Russian economy to speak of without the energy exports. And so I think that they are vulnerable to the energy sanctions. And I think they also are just vulnerable in general to falling global energy prices if economic growth starts faltering in some big regions of the world, or as U.S. production comes online under a Trump administration that is less hostile to energy production than its predecessor was. So I think that you can potentially see signs of strain developing in the Russian economy, and understand that this also has big political economy implications, because that energy export economy in Russia is also the basis of a lot of the relationship between the regime and all of these oligarchs that orbit around that part of the economy. So I think that there are vulnerabilities there. It's not always obvious from the outside exactly where in that cycle we are in terms of, are they close to some kind of collapse? Are they still pretty far away from it? But we can be sure that Putin is probably worried about that too.
Kate, that seems to be the big question. Is just how much pressure does Putin feel now, whether it be in his economy or whether he feels it on the battlefield. Both of those are crucial. Seems to me. Talked to Jack Keane in our program, TV program on the weekend, and he said that he puts a lot more value on the battlefield pressure and the delivery there of the new weapons than he does on sanctions. And I guess it's fair to say heretofore that's correct. I do think, though, that if Trump would actually join the Europeans and really tightening the screws on Putin and basically putting the pressure on India and China for purchasing oil, and the entities that help purchase that Russian oil, it could put a lot more pressure on Putin. And the other thing that I still find inexplicable is that Europe and the West haven't essentially told Putin, look, if you don't have ceasefire here in fairly short order, we're going to take those $300 billion in your reserves that are now frozen, and we're going to take it all. And we're just going to give it to Ukraine, and we're going to buy a lot of weapons for Ukraine. And, instead of holding it out as some kind of carrot that Putin will get if at some future date, when he is satisfied with the amount of Ukraine that he swallowed, he'll get back.
I certainly agree with General Keene's point that the battlefield is the metric that commands most of Putin's attention. But the two are connected. I mean, to add another data point to what Joe was saying, 100,000 Russian soldiers have died on the battlefield since January. That's an astonishing number.
In 6 months, basically.
Yes. And that's an astonishing number. And it is a terrible data point for Russia's human capital problem. And Russia is also having to pay more and do a lot more to press young men into this terrible meat grinder on the front lines. And so the two are connected. And I'd also add, there is pressuring Putin, which obviously now that the Europeans have done this sanctions package, the U.S. help would be all the more additive. But there's also, a relevant message to China. You're describing that China is really helping finance Russia's war with these oil purchases. And they're also contributing a lot of commercial parts and legacy chips into Russia's war machine to get some of those thousands of drones that Russia is launching into Ukraine every night. And so that is another reason that I think should get Trump's attention and in putting some pressure here on that axis of Putin and Xi and in the war.
Our colleague, Gillian Melchior, has just returned on the weekend from about 10 days or so reporting in Ukraine. And she and I were communicating on WhatsApp when her time was when she was there, and particularly in the evening, she would she would get an alert from our security team, head to the bunker. And because she was in Kyiv, there was a drone or missile attack or both on Kyiv, a warning. And she would spend hours in most evenings in the bunker, and sometimes all night. And that's, of course, what Ukrainians are living with all the time. If you're fortunate enough to get into a bunker, if you're not, you could be killed, as many civilians are being killed. Okay, so just to give us a quick summary of where the war is right now. Is it in fact a stalemate, or is Russia making slow gains?
Well, Russia is making slow gains, whether they're not strategically significant at this point. But the thing to remember about even stalemates is that eventually somebody recaptures the initiative. And I think the U.S. has an interest in making sure that it's Ukraine. On the point about those nightly drone attacks, we know Russia is using more and more drones in them. The payloads of those drones are getting larger. They are using decoys in them too. And I mention all this because the prime purpose of these attacks is to wear down Ukrainian morale, convince the Ukrainians they're not going to win the war, might as well give up. But they're also using these sophisticated mix of attacks to just wear out air defense missiles, make Ukraine take more shots at this mix of things. There are decoys in the package. You're looking to find the actual cruise missiles in them. So that is part of the strategy, is to wear down Ukraine's morale, to run us out of interceptors. And that's why we're going to need some larger thinking of the type we're talking about to finally get Putin to the table.
All right. We're going to leave the Russian story here for today. Thank you, Kate Odell, for coming on. We're going to go to my colleague Joe Sternberg, who covered Japan for many years and loves Japan, as I do. I covered it for years as well when I was in Asia, and I've always had a fondness for Japan. But a big story on the weekend is the election, Joe. The majority LDP coalition, Liberal Democratic Party, Komeito Party coalition, lost their majority in the upper house. And of course, they'd lost their majority in the lower house last year. Now, the Japanese opposition is fragmented. So Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is vowing to stay on and essentially govern on an issue-by-issue basis. But that's a difficult proposition.
Well, Paul, I mean, what's interesting about this, I can't remember a time when Japanese politics has been so unsettled. And it isn't just the fact that the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, has lost an election, because they have been out of power for a few years here and there over the past couple decades. I mean, the real startling thing here, as you pointed out, is that we have essentially a minority government now in both houses of the parliament. And that is the instability in what is still one of the world's largest economies, and certainly an anchor strategically and economically in Asia, that I think is so startling here. And it bespeaks a real unsettlement in Japanese society and the economy more broadly. I think that voters have just absolutely had enough of this long period where the economy seemed to be more or less stuck in the doldrums after the bubble collapsed going back to the late 80s, early 90s. And I think that you're starting to finally see the bursting into the political realm of a bunch of social and demographic factors that people have been talking about in Japan for a long time. So, I mean, the story here that we're going to be talking about over the next few minutes is the rise of some of these populist movements in Japanese politics. One of the surprises is that it hadn't happened sooner, but it has definitely arrived now, and it is an unfamiliar experience for Japanese politicians and voters.
Japan is now the fourth largest economy in the world after the U.S., China, and Germany. So it is a very important player. It is, of course, our principal ally in the Asia Pacific, and maybe the most important single ally in the world. You can make that case given its strategic location and its prosperity. The issues that galvanize this election, Joe, are interesting, not unfamiliar to those of us in other Western democracies. Inflation, number one, 3% over the last 6 months, 3% in a row on an annual basis. 3.7% in the last report in May report. And that's been a big issue because the cost of living and real incomes don't seem to be rising, particularly for young people. Where have you heard that before? Second, the consumption tax, which in Japan is 10%. And I was there covering Japan when they first imposed that value-added tax. And it was not popular then. It cost the LDP, the government at that time, the majority control, got it back. But the opposition parties stressed they want to cut the consumption tax, partly for cost of living. And then really interesting in Japan is the issue of immigration. Now, immigration has roiled Europe and the United States and Australia politics, but not Japan, partly because they don't let in a lot of immigrants, but they've let in more in recent years. And the issue particularly that was resonant in Japan this time is foreign tourists who, particularly Chinese tourists who are apparently everywhere in Japan, and in particular are also buying up Japanese property. And that is not sitting well with an element of the population. And the Sanseto Party, the new right-wing party, moved from, I think, 1 seat in the upper house to now we'll have 11. And it really drove immigration as an issue.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that to a lot of Americans or Europeans listening to this discussion of Japanese politics, people might hear some of these issues and think, really? I mean, if they're unhappy about 3% inflation, I mean, if I got news for you after what Americans lived through over the past few years, right?
Right.
So, but again, I mean, on that kind of economic issue, you have to remember how unusual even that 3% inflation is in the Japanese experience after long periods where prices were basically flat or even mildly declining. And I mean, for all of these years, economists have been fretting about deflation in Japan. And so I think that, this is also coming at a time when, despite the best efforts of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe when he was in office, they have never quite unlocked the economic reforms that they would have needed to generate real wage increases. So I think that a lot of Japanese voters are in the situation where they are starting to see the prices go up, but they don't see any prospect that their wages are going to increase in the future to keep pace. And so that creates a lot of unease. And I think that, if you look at an issue like immigration, the numbers are very small, especially as a proportion of the population compared to Europe or the US. We're talking an immigrant population in the neighborhood of, I think, about 3% of the total population. But again, this is in a society that was not accustomed to even that level of immigration, and where I think that they sort of adopted this policy of allowing immigrants to come in to solve the labor market problems of an aging population without thinking enough about how can you reassure the native voters that we're going to deal with issues like assimilation and the rest of it. And then, on tourism, again, I think because the numbers of tourists that they find most vexing are coming from China, that also bespeaks this greater unease that a lot of Japanese feel about their relationship with their much larger neighbor to the West, both culturally and economically and also strategically in security terms. And all of these issues mainstream Japanese political parties had kind of allowed to fester. And now all of a sudden you have this moment where politicians have come along who are proving very adept at really grasping on those issues.
The stakes for the United States in a stable Japan are significant, starting with defense. The Shiba government has vowed to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP. It's currently about 1.8%. But if the opposition prevails in trying to divert more money to social welfare, then that leaves less for defense. And we really need Japan to spend more in the Asia Pacific. They do want to make Tomahawk cruise missiles with us. They have shipbuilding capacity we need. They have ship repair capacity that we need. They have the ability to produce with our cooperation, long-range missiles that could be used in the defense of Taiwan. So it's a very significant issue for us. Second is the trade talks. Donald Trump has threatened a 25% tariff to impose on Japan on August 1st. What will be the ability of the Ishiba government to be able to deliver a deal with the United States, so something that Donald Trump would accept? If Trump slaps a 25% tariff on Japan on August 1st, it's going to hurt, and it's going to hurt the government.
It's going to be really difficult, especially because one of the most sensitive issues in Japanese politics right now is the economy and particularly the employment prospects of a lot of the working age and younger working age men who seem to have gravitated toward these protest populist parties. Because again, I mean, sociologists and demographers have been writing for decades now about the problem that Japan has absorbing these men into the workforce and creating economic and social opportunities for them. And now all of a sudden, not only does the traditional political class in Tokyo not have any good solutions for that, but you have a major trading partner, the US, coming along and threatening a trade policy, imposing tariffs that are going to be very damaging for the Japanese economy. But I think that one of the fundamental problems here, which ties together all of this and also the military spending issue that you raised a moment ago, Paul, is the health of the economy. And I think that this election result happened because no mainstream political party really has been able to make a convincing offer to the Japanese voters about how they are going to achieve sustained economic growth into the future. And if you can't have that, you can't do the military spending because you won't be able to afford it, especially when the national debt is at 250% of GDP at this point. If you don't have that economic growth, you aren't going to be able to create opportunities, especially for some of these left behind demographic groups like working age men, who are now becoming a political force to reckon with after this election. You're not going to be able to manage any of the social or economic issues that come from the migration. So this is the big failure in Tokyo. It's been out there wide in the open for decades that we've been writing about their economic failures. And I think that it is now really showing up in the election returns in a big way.
Joe, I just heard you outlining a column for our listeners. Anyway, I think we'll leave it at that. But it's the Japanese economic problem is not unknown in the rest of the West at this moment. But finding a solution to it is crucial, and Japan-U.S. relationship is also arguably, maybe after the U.S. and China, the most important in the world. All right, so thanks, Joe. Thanks to Kate Odell as well, and thank you all for listening. We are here every day on Potomac Watch, and we hope you'll be with us the rest of the week. Thanks for listening.